Hi everyone, welcome back to Gentlemen Prefer Cinephiles. I'm so unbelievably excited that you're here. So today on our 2019 recap, we are going to be talking about The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers. Wow, what an excellent movie, am I right? On my YouTube channel, I covered the best movies of the last decade, so if you're interested, go check that out. But The Lighthouse was definitely on it. It's one of my favorite movies of the last year, and for a lot of reasons, but particularly I'm very biased because I consider one of my areas of film study, I guess, to be fetish in film. I'm working on a huge conference talk about it. I'm working on paper about it. I hope that's hopefully going to be published, all this stuff. And it's just honestly, I think The Lighthouse is excellent example of all the stuff I've been studying about fetish and all the conclusions I've been trying to make about fetish in film. And so I'm just going to kind of talk about all of that. So first, to give a brief synopsis of The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is about two lighthouse keepers, one played by Willem Dafoe, one played by Robert Pattinson. I'm just going to call them by their actor names because I don't even remember if the film even gave them names, aside from Man 1, Man 2. I'm spacing. I haven't seen it since it was in theaters. Anyway. So it's about those two keepers. They're both on this lighthouse just off the coast of, I think they're in New England. So those two lighthouse keepers, they go to this little area off of the coast of New England, I believe, or on the coast of New England. And they're pretty much just there for an extended period of time to take care of the lighthouse. And this is all set in the late 1800s. So it's a really, really interesting look at manhood. It's a really interesting look at manhood. It's a really interesting look at society. It's a really interesting look at sex and things like that. So we're going to go talk about it today. So yeah, excellent. So it's a very basic plot summary. I'm trying to it's very difficult because it's difficult to find the balance between film analysis and not spoiling everything. You know what I mean? But yeah, anyway, go Redbox Lighthouse or something if you haven't seen it. It's excellent. So to start it off, so The Lighthouse, one of the biggest things that it deals with is the whole idea of isolation and what isolation does to the individual. That's, I think, at the core of the movie. If we're looking at cores of movies, so continuing the thread off of our Parasite episode last week, Parasite, the core of that was the whole idea of class struggle. And I think when you're looking at The Lighthouse, the core of that is what isolation does to the individual. So extending off of that and looking at that as a very strong narrative trope, I think the way the film utilizes everything visually to continue to tell that story in terms of isolation is very, very, very interesting. Because the thing I love about The Lighthouse is how I always use this when describing very meditative films, but the very ethereal quality to it. A lot of the movie is just you watching Robert Pattinson go about his day as a lighthouse keeper. And that is so unbelievably fascinating on so many different levels. Just because of the extended period of time it takes to show us the struggle that it is, him going through what he's doing and what his job is, combined with the mental toll we're seeing it take on him in the way he can't express himself, the way he can't relate to other people, especially this other Willem Dafoe character, and how he can extrapolate based on that his other relationships in life. It's just the way that plays off of the whole idea of isolation is really interesting. And also particularly in the cinematic language, how it's framed also really strongly, showcases that. We get a lot of really big wide shots where Robert Pattinson is generally speaking center of frame, but the other interesting thing about it is he's usually the smallest thing within the larger frame, which was very, very fascinating, which was a very fascinating decision to me because it just emphasized this kind of encroaching a loneliness that he's feeling. It's not even that he just feels that way internally. The filmmakers are visually showing you how isolated he is compared to the world around him in any sense of the word, whether that's, societally speaking, whether that's looking at him versus nature. He feels so alone that, when you look at the camera and when you look at the big, vast landscape and then this little tiny image of Robert Pattinson going about his day, it really just drives that point home in a very, in a very snap, symbiosis, in a very snap judgment symbiotic kind of way for an audience. So, it's not even something that you acknowledge even. It's not even wow, look at how small he is compared to everything else. It's just a visual cue that really just drives home that he's so alone. And that was really, really interesting. I really, really liked that. And I also liked that continuation off of other things from the filmmaker, like The Witch. I think it was The Witch. Yeah, The Witch. Because The Witch is also really interesting in how it showcases loneliness. So, I really loved that through line with the filmmaker's work. But yeah. And then like further than the whole idea that they're alone on this island, because that's like an implicit, but just the way the film really drives that home as well with the visuals is super interesting, because you get this like image of the sea as this. And it was great because, okay, when I experienced the ocean for the first time, it was like I want to say it was like 4 or 5 years ago for the first time I saw the ocean, right? Or like I remember seeing the ocean or whatever. And I remember I didn't feel anything but overwhelmed. Like, I didn't feel excited to see it. I didn't feel like, wow, look, it's the ocean. Let's go see what's going on. I just felt overwhelmed. And I felt like it was really dangerous, and it caused a lot of anxiety, I guess. And I think the way that I felt in that moment was the exact same direction that the filmmaker took with showcasing the sea and the ocean in the lighthouse, and that plays into the feelings of isolation that the two men are feeling. So when you look at the ocean, it's this very like encroaching figure, or it's this very relentless figure, and it kind of like serves as a kind of narrative visual through line of this whole idea of the universe, because when we're looking at the idea of loneliness that Robert Pattinson is experiencing within the lighthouse, or his character is, it's this very existential sense that I get when you hear, like, if you hear like a filmmaker like Stanley Kubrick talking about it, you know what I mean? And it's like the scariest thing about the universe is not that it's like this force against you. The scariest thing about it is that it's indifferent towards you. And I think the way the sea was utilized, it really showcased that in particular, because, you know, there's this sense of indifference towards the two men. And I say that knowing that, you know, throughout the film, the two men influence, I'm putting that in air quotes because a lot of the film is very like hyper surreal, and it's hard to differentiate reality versus like what's actually happening, reality and fantasy, reality and like this other plane of existence. But the sea has this very foreboding, like, these are the rules. It doesn't matter who you are. This is the sense of what this is, X, Y, and Z. So yeah, that's really, really interesting. And also, like, cinematographically speaking, talking about existentialism, I think maybe the through line for that is a lot of the ways the sea was shot, and like the men were framed against the rocks in the sea. It felt a lot like that painting. It's called like Wanderer Above the Sea Fog, I think. And it was like, the cinematography reminded me very strongly of that. Excellently done. But yeah, so moving into my next point, this whole kind of idea of difference in approach to sexuality between these two men, and these two men kind of like, these two men working out their manhood alone on this island. That was really, really interesting, because, you know, some people may say like male power complex, but like I always see it in terms of fetish as opposed to like, so I think it's just a terminology semantics thing. So when we're looking at the idea of differences in approaches to sexuality between the two men, I think that's a jumping off point definitely from the isolation that they're feeling. Because, you know, because of a lot of things, they're not able to fully express themselves sexually as they need to, I guess. And then especially looking at Robert Pattinson's character, there's this very distinct difference in openness about sexuality and about relationship that Willem Dafoe's character has that Robert Pattinson doesn't. And you get a sense of that through the little vignettes that they have throughout the movie. And you also get like an overt sense of that when, like, you know, the two men are fighting, and it's like at a point in the film where, like, you know, reality and you know, fantasy are blending together, reality and dreamscape are blending together, and you get this moment where the two men like almost kiss, and then Robert Pattinson freaks out about it. It's very, very interesting. If you missed it, I encourage you to go back and watch it. It's the subtlest moment in the movie, and it's excellent. But yeah, this closed off sense of sexuality is very, very fascinating to me, and I feel like some people can talk about it in terms of the male power complex, you know, but I just see male power complex as another way to like look at fetish, in how fetish functions in our own world, especially when, you know, we don't deal with sexuality, so we fetishize it to the point where it controls every part of us. And that's what I think was the interesting thing about The Lighthouse to me, was how in my study of fetish, right, in my study of fetish in real life versus in film, the very, very interesting thing to me with the idea of repressed sexuality, whether that's, you know, whether that's repressed like homosexuality orientation, or whether that's, you know, repressed in terms of you're not even expressing sexual feelings in a traditional societal sense with like a, you know, a married partner, because you've developed such an unhealthy relationship to sex, you know. I think it comes out in a lot of different ways, and so like there's a lot of ways you can interpret that, you know, fetishization of sex, and this whole like repression of sex. There's a lot of ways that comes out in people. Yes. Anyway, to continue. So for example, we see Robert Pattinson very early on in the movie. There's a scene where he's fixing the roof, and Willem Dafoe is inside and he's outside, right? Willem Dafoe, they like switch off, so like one sleeps while the other works, and they continue this cycle, right? And so very early on in the movie, Robert Pattinson finds this little like mermaid figurine, right? And it becomes kind of this object of fetish and object of desire that he just kind of continuously expresses throughout the movie. And it's the only kind of outlet he has for that. But it's very, very interesting because kind of you get the sense that Robert Pattinson is very isolated, but there's a very strong direct link to sex very early on in the movie when he peeks into the floorboards, and I think he sees him masturbating, right? I think he sees Willem Dafoe's character masturbating, and it's an image that's ingrained in his head, and it's not even the fact that he desires the Willem Dafoe character, it's the fact that he desires sex so much that, you know, being exposed to it like that, it suddenly becomes something that's controlling his every thought and every mind. We do also get a lot of sequences of Robert Pattinson, you know, masturbating and things like that to the mermaid figurine, which is just, you know, another expression, and it feeds into this whole idea that he's alone because he can't express himself and he can't get what he wants. He has to, you know, he has to project that onto like a little figurine of a fictional being, you know. And so that emphasizes in his psyche what he's not getting. And, you know, it leads to dream sequences later on that are like him having sex with a mermaid, and it's really, really fascinating. But the point of violence comes with, so Robert Pattinson increasingly gets more and more and more and more and more stressed out, angry, upset throughout his time on the island, right? On this island while he's, you know, doing all of his work. And I think, it's like 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, whether it's him frustrated that he can't engage in sex, and you know, him being frustrated that he's so alone and isolated. I think they both exist separately, right? But they represent each other as well. They like mirror each other very strongly, I guess. I'm talking about this very, very like hoity-toity, artsy-fartsy, so I hope you guys are with me right now. But yeah, so the violence comes when the seagull that's been bothering, you know, Robert Pattinson this entire time, it just kind of like drops in, and Willem Dafoe explicitly tells him, you know, don't mess with the seagulls because they're the souls of dead sailors, I believe. Dead sailors, people lost at sea. And so like the seagull keeps like going to see Robert Pattinson. The seagull keeps going around, you know, seeing what he's doing. He's following him around. He keeps annoying him. And finally there's a point at which Robert Pattinson snaps, and I think it's in part because he's so isolated in terms of like he's not around anyone except Willem Dafoe, and even then he's barely around Willem Dafoe. And also, you know, he can't get his sexual urges out, and those are controlling his every part. So it quickly turns into violence, and it's acted out against the seagull, and that's when, you know, you get the whole kind of the sea coming after the men, in this whole sense of, like I said before, this idea of, you know, finite universal rules that are indifferent to the individual and indifferent to humans. So it's interesting getting, you know, these two men being punished for encroaching on, you know, the feminine rules that come with the sea and the sea governing. It's very interesting because, like, you know, I'm not super familiar with, like, you know, pirate lore and sea lore and things like that, but I know just on a distant sense that, like, you know, like pirates were very, very oh my god, what is the term? Superstitious. They were a superstitious group of people, and that was really interesting because, you know, they were one part superstitious, but also like had this sense of the divine female in a lot of that superstition, which was very, very fascinating. And I think all of that also comes into the Lighthouse, because what was interesting to me was the discussion of, because, you know, one of the big questions that everybody kept asking Robert Eggers while he was like doing like a bunch of interviews. I was watching like just a bunch of them at a bunch of different film festivals, and one of the questions that always comes up is this idea of like, well, why are you doing a period piece? Like, what is the point of that? And he talked about it as, one, he talked about immense research involved in the period pieces, in which that was super, super interesting, but also how he felt that period pieces can unlock a lot about what is wrong in today's world through the past, you know what I mean? It's the idea of like, you know, extending off of what he was saying, it's the idea that, you know, if you don't understand the past, you're destined to repeat it. That was super, super interesting, because that also kind of comes into, you know, the Lighthouse. Because like I said, we have groups of people in which, you know, they have this same perspective on sex that like characters like Robert Pattinson have, and it comes out in violence in the same way it does in The Lighthouse. And it's really interesting to see that reflected in, you know, today's world when, you know, the film is late 1800s, it's set in the late 1800s, and we kind of get this sense, we get this like idea in our own world like, oh well, we're so far past that, obviously there's nothing that's carried over from that socially, X, Y, and Z, but so much has crossed over from that, and so that was super, super interesting. But yeah. So there's a whole lot of other things to talk about in The Lighthouse, but I felt like the fetish angle was the biggest one for me. I haven't had a chance to rewatch it yet, and I feel like when I rewatch it, I'll have a lot more to talk about in terms of like other things the film dealt with very strongly. Because I also think, you know, I really, really loved Willem Dafoe's character. I thought he was just so fascinating and interesting. Like, he was just the most charming pirate. I love his little pirate voice. His accent that he used, it was amazing. It was so good. But I also really like this, like, I like the idea of this old man who kind of just goes around and like is alone all the time, because like we get this idea, like Robert Pattinson, we assume, we're like, oh wow, it's the dangers of being alone and how that drives a person insane. But it really is dependent on the person, because it's very interesting to see, you know, Willem Dafoe as like a foil for Robert Pattinson's character, in that, you know, he's been alone longer than Robert Pattinson has doing the same job. And so what makes it so that he isn't, you know, driven crazy by this isolation, whereas Robert Pattinson is. That's very, very interesting. And also the whole idea, the whole story in the middle of the film where Robert Pattinson talks about why he has to take the jobs he does, you know, and this whole, this whole like violent outburst he had while he was working on, like, he was cutting down trees, he was doing something like that. I'm completely spacing on the technical term for that, but that story is also really interesting in how it plays into, like, you know, who Robert Pattinson is versus who Willem Dafoe is. You know, further on the fetish angle, we get, like, you know, Willem Dafoe playing dog while Pattinson is like telling him what to do, and that was very, very fascinating. It has this kind of turnaround that's very similar to, if you've seen Mother by Darren Aronofsky, there's a point at which the whole film just kind of implodes and like a bunch of stuff is happening, and you're just being bombarded with surreal imagery after this really, really long meditative, like 3/4 of the film, it's very like quiet, it's very introspective, it's very blah 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 blah. You're going along, you're like, wow, this is washing over me like a nice gentle wave, and then all of a sudden it ramps up to full typhoon, which was very, very interesting in terms of pacing, but I think it also just enhanced the movie overall because it increased the stakes for sure. But yeah, it was just super, super interesting, and even just the last image of, you know, Willem Dafoe being buried alive and like just like spouting all of this like manifestos of the avant-garde. It was just, I just loved it. I thought The Lighthouse was an excellent film. I thought it was beautifully done. I thought it was beautifully shot. And yeah, so that's The Lighthouse by Roger Eggers. I feel like Robert Eggers, I'm so sorry. I keep calling you Roger. I'm so sorry if I called you Roger any other time. If you're listening to this, I thought your movie was excellent. Thank you for making it. Okay, but thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it. Or listening if you're out there. Then later this week, we're talking about Uncut Gems, and then Evelyn has the Movies After Midnight episode, and then we're talking about the rating system on this Saturday show. So yeah, I will see you guys then. I also just kind of wanted to mention, I kind of just wanted to have like a little heart-to-heart with anyone out there. Okay, so it was yesterday. It was the 2-year anniversary of the podcast, and I just have to say I'm so unbelievably grateful. I remember like last year I had this like idea where I was like, you know, what's the point in even continuing the podcast? Like, who am I to do the podcast alone? Blah, 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 blah. Maybe I shouldn't do it alone. Maybe I'm going to be boring. Maybe X, Y, and Z. But like all the growth we've experienced and all the like people we've added to the podcast. We've had people all the way from like, you know, Korea to Spain to Australia to Japan. We've had people in over 70 countries watch and listen to the podcast, which is mind-blowing to me. We have over 3,000 listeners. It is wild, and I cannot believe the growth, and I'm so unbelievably grateful and excited to go along with you and continue this journey. But thank you all so much for being here with me. I'm just so unbelievably grateful that, you know, you guys want to hear my rambling about movies and my opinion. But yeah, thank you guys so much. You can find us on any social platform: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can find me at _Renaissance Woman on all the social platforms: Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, all that stuff. But yeah, thank you all so much, and I will see you tomorrow with Bombshell. Bye.